And somebody commented, who knew about that myth of Marduk and Tiamat, that in fact Marduk, which I should have remembered, cut Tiamat in half and made heaven from one half and earth from the other. So there you have a wonderful example of the split. And that was 1700 BC. So now we come to part 2. And I've just repeated here what I said in the last one about the great civilizations of the Bronze Age holding this lunar idea of the cosmos being a living being. Somebody came up to me in the break to talk about the Vedic tradition, of course, in India, where Brahman is the whole, everything, every stone, every leaf. And that idea has stayed alive in India all this time, but you can see what's happening now, that our technological culture is being superimposed on that ancient Indian mythic feeling, really, with, I fear, terrible consequences, particularly for the poor people of India, who still absolutely believe that their gods and goddesses are present with them and helping them with their lives. So this world was seen as an epiphany or showing forth of an unseen source or ground that breathed it into being, animating and sustaining it. And the spiritual aim in these different cultures was to follow practices which align the human community with this divine ground. Now you find that idea in Parmenides, a pre-Socratic philosopher in the 6th century BC, who used to undergo the rite of incubation, in which he left his body and moved into this other dimension and met with the goddess Persephone, who gave him teachings to bring back to the world of mortals. And it's a wonderful image, really. And he was one of a great line of shaman teachers, can't actually remember their specific name, that lasted for 500 years, and their names are actually inscribed on a tablet at a place called Veglia in southern Italy, which is south of Naples. And my short-term memory is gone, but I had a great friend who wrote a book called In the Dark Places of Wisdom. That's right. A great friend. Anyway, my memory has failed me there. But that goes into the whole story of Parmenides and this great chain or line of shaman healers that he belonged to, or that he started, really. And as I say, it survived in the indigenous cultures in various forms. Even in Outer Mongolia, there was a book written called something about the horse boy, I think, about a man who took his boy to the reindeer people in Outer Mongolia, and he was healed of his problems. Extraordinary, really, that this tradition has gone on for so long. So now I want to just go through different traditions of the alchemical transformation, the idea of transforming consciousness, and that it existed in these different cultures. First of all, I've got India there, although that's a Buddhist image. The Buddha actually, as it were, revivified the Vedic tradition and gave it a new slant or a new twist. But he's actually sitting on the coils of the great serpent Musalinda, which goes back to the shamanic tradition, because that great serpent, in a way, is an image of the Kundalini rising up from the base of the spine within us and spreading out as those great hoods of the serpent behind his head. So he incarnates this wisdom, really, of the ancient Vedic tradition, which goes back at least, I should think, 10,000 years. So all these different traditions, I've got the Tibetan one at the top, middle one, and then on the right-hand side I've got Muhammad's journey to the inner worlds. Then, of course, down below we've got Egypt, and in the middle China, and finally the European tradition. So all these traditions, in their various ways, kept alive the connection between the visible and invisible worlds. And the primary teaching of these traditions was the union with the ground of spirit through a process of gradual illumination, leading to an awakened consciousness. I found this. I was long ago in my 20s, I made a great journey through the Far East. And I got this particular image from a museum in Thailand, and I've always kept it as kind of talisman. I think it's the most wonderful image. So in India, this path of alignment is called Nagayuna, the path of the serpent. And this is the origin of Kundalini Yoga, which goes back to Vedic times and is many thousands of years old. This Buddhist sculpture carries forward the ancient Vedic tradition of raising the immense creative power of instinct within us from a state of unconsciousness to a state of fully awakened or illumined consciousness. And the aim, of course, as you know, of the Buddhist tradition and also the Vedic was release from the wheel of rebirth. The idea of the illumination was that you would be free of the need to reincarnate, but at the same time, in the Buddhist tradition, you come back to this world as a teacher, if you desire to do so, to bring other people out of the great sea of being into the illumined state. Here is this wonderful Tibetan image which shows the union of the male and female principles, the union of wisdom and compassion. And here again is the union of the two great instinctual powers of the human soul raised to their highest and most exalted state. The female form, the red one, represents transcendent wisdom, the wisdom that flows from the direct experience of reality. And the male form represents the power to express that wisdom as compassion for all living beings. So these figures in their essence portray the divine potential of the human soul, the divine potential in every single one of us. And here is an image of the Taoist tradition, China. And the process that leads to illumination in this tradition is called the circulation of the light. And this is expounded in the text called The Secret of the Golden Flower that excited Jung so much because he found in this Eastern alchemy the replica or the resonance, as it were, of the Western tradition of alchemy. And he saw that both were saying that this process of circulation, almost sometimes a spiral circulation, is the same in both traditions. And this is a Japanese image, which again I got on my travels, of a sage receiving a visitation from immortal beings. He is a Taoist sage sitting in his retreat in the mountains somewhere. And here is an image from the tradition of Kabbalah, painted by a modern Kabbalist. It was on the cover of Warren Kenton's book on Kabbalah. Warren Kenton has given me permission to teach Kabbalah, but actually I've never had a chance of teaching it, but it's incorporated into everything that I'm doing today. So this is the Jewish mystical tradition, and many of the European alchemists were Kabbalists as well, both Jewish Kabbalists and Christian Kabbalists. And the basic concept of Kabbalah is the emanation of the Godhead through all dimensions of reality until it reaches our world. So we have the same idea of the divinity being above and below. And in the sense that I am, you can see the I am at the top of this tree of life, and the I am is at the very bottom as well. So it goes all the way through the dimensions of being until it reaches our world, where it is embodied in the life of this world. It's a most wonderful tradition, very, very complicated, but Warren Kenton's work has clarified it, I think, for our culture, and if any of you know it, I would recommend it. So the tree of life of Kabbalah really offers a template of humanity's ascent from unconsciousness to cosmic consciousness. Then we have the Sufi tradition. Many great teachers, of course, Rumi, the poems of Rumi, which have been so popular in the last 20 or 30 years. And they have the idea of El-Qadir, the teacher, who manifests to the aspiring Sufi, and who's the great teaching image in Sufism. So you see, this idea of transformation of consciousness goes right the way through these different traditions. Here you have this is actually from Frobenius, the man whose leg Paracelsus healed. He was a printer, and this is obviously an image from his work. It says Johannes Frobenius, and here you have the entwined serpents up the central staff, which is exactly the same image as you find in Kundalini Yoga. It's quite possible that the alchemists knew about this, that the cross-fertilization of traditions, they may have even had images of this process within themselves. Then you have the subtle body, which is a modern image. This tradition goes right the way through. From the earliest cultures, the idea that we have another body, a subtle body, an immortal body, a resurrection body, many different names, goes back long before Western civilization, so to speak. But this is a kind of synthesis of what's come through to us today, with all the chakras. Then you have this beautiful image of a Cree Indian in America, just to represent the fact that the indigenous peoples kept alive the lunar tradition of the sacredness of the earth and the values and rituals that respected this view. Thank goodness they are speaking up now. We can begin to hear their voice all over the world. And they're really trying to wake us up to the lunacy of the way we live. But a kind of false lunacy, I guess, not the true lunacy. And then finally we come to the image of the Black Madonna, which Roger Woolger has done so much to bring into our awareness. And in Europe, the ancient tradition of the sacredness of the earth was transmitted to the image of the Black Madonna, who descends directly from the lunar Great Mother. So that ties up another missing piece, as it were, of this huge puzzle. That image, by the way, was from Solsona in Spain, which has had many miraculous cures about her image. So, to summarize this whole sort of tradition, really, we carry within us two ways of knowing. One is the instinctive, participatory and lunar way of knowing, kept alive in all the traditions that I've just shown you. And the other is the rational, objective, solar way of knowing that was superimposed on the older way, and which gradually suppressed or repressed this ancient instinctual knowledge and its vast store of wisdom and experience. So a radical imbalance developed in Western civilization as we lost touch with the lunar way of knowing and all awareness of the sacredness of the life of the earth and the cosmos. My hearing aid is squeaking. It's a great bore. I hope it's not interfering with the transmission. So alchemy is called the royal art. Each one of us carries latent within us the royal value, the greater, finer, more complete or whole person we are capable of becoming, symbolized by the mysterious stone or gold of the alchemist. Alchemy is a gradual process of revelation, incarnation, illumination, and transfiguration. It's the science of transmuting the base metal of the pre-conscious soul into the gold of the awakened soul that is reunited with its cosmic ground. The emphasis is on building awareness of and communion with spirit, and creating an incorruptible body of light or subtle body that will hold this relationship beyond the death of the physical body. Anybody like a lozenge?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Another one? These are very good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now, this Zosimus of Panopolis gave this lovely saying, "I swear to you that if you do this work properly, you will have a river of flowing gold. Now this is the most important point, or one of the most important points, because whereas Christianity taught that the Redeemer is outside us, and that our redemption as Christians has been assured by Christ's sacrificial death, alchemy taught that the alchemist can become the redeemer or rescuer of the lost aspect of spirit that's hidden within himself and nature, working with spirit, helping spirit to accomplish this awakening within him. Now this gives great importance to the individual and significance to the individual, because the divine drama of redemption is consummated in and through us, and it's really dependent on us. It's an awesome and heroic task. Each one of us carries the mystery of the incarnation of spirit in this dimension. So alchemy was really like a sacred rite, what they called an opus divinum, a divine work. So together,
Sorry, Anne, can you just
go back?
what to write? It's not so packed.
Sorry, yeah. It's better to buy the DVD afterwards. I don't know whether it will go back. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
When will that come out?
Sorry?
When will that come out?
That depends on Rob and Lee, but I should think about a month. Yeah, and you can contact me through my website. Tell me when you're ready. Okay? So, together, we're all playing a crucial participatory role. I stress the word participatory, in the incarnation or awakening of spirit, which is the living gold within us and all creation. And I think that's why Jung said that man is indispensable for the completion of creation. He is himself the second creator of the world. But it's very difficult to become aware of this role because we're so encased in our way of thinking. It's difficult to set aside time to bring it into being, time for contemplation and meditation, and time to observe the synchronicities and the things that come to us, as it were, which we may not have noticed before. So it's a long process, really, of becoming aware of what's happening. Now, there was an alchemist called Rulon the lexicographer who said, imagination is the star in man, the celestial and supercelestial body. So imagination is much, much more than it's been sort of made out to be, really. It's the actual ground of our thinking. It's coming from this deep instinct within us, which in turn connects us to the invisible dimension of the soul of the cosmos. It's coming to us from the cosmos and is the ground of all our thinking and feeling and imagining and dreaming, everything really. So it's imagination is like a psychic reality, a subtle body or field that we tune into when we create from the deepest level. Think of Chartres Cathedral or Mozart. Think of the tuning in process, unconscious probably at the time they were creating this magnificent work, but nevertheless something is coming through that imagination to create these miracles that we admire now or listen to. So it's like another dimension which interpenetrates our dimension and interacts with it. It can act as a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds. It seems to be the very ground of our consciousness, something which underlies the physical reality that we perceive with our five senses, yet cannot be perceived by them. Jung said that the subtle body is a transcendental concept which cannot be expressed in terms of our language or our philosophical views, because they are all inside the categories of time and space, whereas this imagination is really outside those categories.
And Blake has said, imagination is God.
Yes, he said
That really is.
he got it right, or at least I think he did. I think it was Rupert Sheldrake who said that our imagination comes to us from the imagination of the cosmos. I haven't actually got his quote here, but I remember that. So the alchemist said, Trismosin, this is in his wonderful book Splendor Solis, which I'm going to show you the pictures of later. Study what thou art, whereof thou art a part. All that is without thee also is within. So when you look back at what I've just been saying, that everything is spirit. So everything that we study, we're studying spirit. We're studying what we're part of. We're becoming aware that we belong to something that is everything, so to speak. And all this is carried within ourselves as well as spread out outside us. I think it was Jesus who said, the kingdom of God is spread out upon the earth, but man does not see it. Now I come to the 7 tasks of alchemy. First of all, the rescue of the aspect of spirit that is lost in matter. Secondly, the process of transformation that's involved with this rescue. Thirdly, the death of the old king and queen, that's the old dissociated consciousness, that they've been split apart from each other. One is cut off from consciousness and the other has too much control over everything. Fourthly, the birth of the young king and queen, which is the new integrated solar and lunar consciousness. And we have in our politicians, we've got 2 young kings and 1 old one. And it is a great question of what's going to happen, really. But that archetype is going right the way through the political situation at the present time.
What do you mean now?
What do I mean? I mean that because of the way that a new leader of the tribe is selected, this goes back to Neolithic times, that when the old leader was getting too old and infirm, they killed him off and chose a new one in order that the life of the tribe should be regenerated. Otherwise, if it was connected with the older leader, it meant that the tribe wasn't strong, wasn't sort of going to survive. So this is, even in our own times, this is still coming up. So then we have number 5, the union of the 2 natures in the form of the hermaphrodite. We have the conscious union of body, soul and spirit, which have all been fragmented and split apart. And finally the union with what the alchemists call the unus mundus, the divine ground, which includes everything. So the completion of these 7 tasks brings into being the stone, or the divine elixir, or the flower of immortality. Have you had enough time to write down? Yeah? Okay. So here we have the alchemist holding the vase or flask which contains the prima materia. The prima materia. Now I'm going to look at some of the primary images of alchemy, which are very important for understanding it. This 16th century painting is by an alchemist called Salomon Trismosin, from an exquisite manuscript in the British Museum called Splendor Solis. And it shows an alchemist holding a flask that's half filled with liquid and standing barefoot in a landscape, surrounded by a wonderful border of flowers, birds and animals.
the woman come from?
I think he came from Germany, as far as I know.
The painted clothes of Germany.
Mm-hmm. Nobody's quite sure whether the man who painted the images is the one who wrote the text that went with it. But that's the name that's come down to us with this manuscript. He's wearing the royal purple robe, which indicates an awakened consciousness. And just as nature transforms metals and crystals in the womb of the earth, so the alchemist will transform the elements of his soul in the sacred space of this flask. Now, I want to say one thing more about something that came up as a question before about this business of projection of the images into the alchemical retort. But in therapy, in Jungian therapy, we're aware of the field which holds the relationship between the therapist and the person who's come as a client. And that field definitely relates the two to each other, and it brings up something from the unconscious which will affect both the therapist and the client. So this is much more what is meant, I think, by what alchemists were seeing in their retort and experiencing as a field connecting that matter in the vessel with their own consciousness. I just thought I ought to make that clearer. It's a very important point. So there's this field which is connecting the psyche of the alchemist or the therapist with the matter which is between, as it were, the client coming or the matter in the retort. There's this field holding both together. But I think the vessel was like a mirror reflecting what was happening in the psyche and helping him to understand what was happening there. And it's also likely that the alchemist had visions of these images or saw them while he was meditating. So what is the meaning of this term prima materia, or primal matter, that the alchemist holds in his flask? The alchemist said, "This matter lies before the eyes of all. Everybody sees it, touches it, loves it, and knows it not. It is glorious and vile, precious and of small account, and is found everywhere. To be brief, our matter has as many names as there are things in the world, and that is why the foolish know it not." But could they have meant perhaps that the spirit is the prima materia, present within everything, yet unrecognized by everyone? It just occurred to me when I was working for some time ago that this was what they meant. So the prima materia, this is a wonderful image really of the material that's held in the unconscious, waiting to be communicated to the conscious mind. So the prima materia is the foundation of the alchemical work, the raw material out of which the stone or gold is to be produced. The gold is there, waiting to be mined. The alchemist said to look for the prima materia in what has been most despised. Now, what was this during this 2,000 years of Christianity? I think it was the body. It was our deepest instincts, the deepest feelings, the buried traumas. This was all what was pushed down below the surface of consciousness and not attended to, as it were. So in the prima materia are all the elements that have been split off or shut out of the conscious mind. The alchemists also call the prima materia the black earth and the dragon, and sometimes even shit. I'll come back to that later, because no, now actually. When Paracelsus started his teaching at the University of Basel, he put a steaming pot of human excrement on the table and said, "This is what the work is about. This is life. This is God." So the horrified students pulled him off the podium and chased him out of the room because that was absolute heresy. And he was taking a terrible risk in saying that, let alone trying to teach the students anything. So into the flask of the alchemist went all the elements of our nature, all the elements of life, the perplexing mixture of good and evil, light and dark, all the instincts, the feelings, the passions, all the hurts, the loves, the hatreds, the lusts and the longings, all that has been constructed as the framework in which we live our lives and try to find our orientation in them. Because we ourselves are the prima materia. Now I come to the dragon, and I'm going to come back to him in more detail later. But the dragon is a most eloquent image of the prima materia, or the black earth, because it's the image of the immense and unrecognized power or energy of the instinct that lives through all of us and in all of us, and that lives in the whole life of the planet and the cosmos. This is all the huge power of instinct, which ultimately is the creative and destructive power of life itself that lives in and through all of us. As with the Eastern tradition, the art of the alchemist was to assist in bringing this apparently chaotic power to its fully awakened state, yet never to forget that he was its servant, never its master. And the so-called black arts describe the work of an alchemist who was in the thrall of the dragon, who served his own desire for power. Now today we believe we're in control of our instincts, and yet we are in fact, as Jung observed, controlled and directed by them in ways that we're not aware of. Although thinking seems to be so conscious and so rational, it's inseparably entangled with the feelings and instincts that come through to us from archaic levels of consciousness. And our belief systems, whether religious or scientific, as well as our ways of relating to each other as individuals and nations, are rooted in instinctive responses which have their origins in earlier phases of our evolution, and which we carry with us, as it were, as part of our the whole neurophysiology of our bodily system, not only our brain system, but the whole body. The unconscious responses of the reptilian and mammalian brain system are immensely conservative and immensely powerful, and these are what the dragon stands for. Above all else, the dragon is perhaps the survival instinct. And if you think a bit, I think you'll reflect a bit, you can see how, I mean, even in organizing this conference, for instance, this seminar, I have to, my own survival instinct comes in. What would be best? How can I best present it? What is best not only for everybody else, but how's my voice going to survive the whole day? That's the survival instinct coming in, really. You can see how tiny and fragile the heroic figure here is in relation to the huge size and power of the dragon. Now I come on to the idea of the soul. This is not only in Platonic philosophy, but it goes back to everything that I've been talking about, to this idea of the whole of the world and the whole cosmos being conscious. So the soul is really the anima mundi, or the cosmic sea of being, or subtle body underlying physical reality. The alchemists called this subtle body the lumen naturae, the light of nature, the light that is the hidden ground of the manifest world, the light which manifests as all the forms in the visible universe, including not only the cosmic forms but the earthly forms. It's the root or matrix of our consciousness and can be symbolized by a cosmic woman, as well as by the image of the anthropos, whose body was believed to be spread out through the whole cosmos. And also it's represented by the image of divine wisdom, the wisdom of this great subtle body. And in the tradition of Kabbalah, it's represented by the Shekinah. That came into my last seminar. So we live in this subtle field, although we have no awareness of it, or very little awareness. And in alchemy, it's symbolized by Luna, the queen, and as I say, by the lumen naturae. Now, I've got this painting here by Cecil Collins again, and a tremendously powerful painting, which my mother used to own, and then sold it to the Tate. So it's now in the Tate. And hopefully it's on display, but I haven't been to look at it. But it was so overpowering, my father didn't like it, and said to my mother, please sell it, so that's what she did.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah?
It's your therapist. In talking about the reptilian brain, how do you understand something like schizophrenia, where the ego disintegrates and we go into a symbolic world?
I can't explain it.
That's your question.
I can't explain it, but it can be that the left hemisphere of the brain has been too repressive of the right, and it's then overwhelmed by the right and everything that comes with the right, so to speak.
Or the right's
And well, it's kind of splintering.
under stress.
Yeah, it's a splintering of the prima materia, really. If that is an answer for your question. Okay. Now, where am I? Cecil Collins. Yes, now I come to divine wisdom. Because this feminine image of divine wisdom as the Holy Spirit is really the presiding image of alchemy, particularly European alchemy. The origin of this may have come from the goddess cultures of the lunar era, or from the wisdom texts of the Bible, where wisdom speaks as the Holy Spirit and offers the bread of understanding and the water of wisdom to man. They're the most wonderful texts in the book of the Wisdom of Solomon and the book of Ben Sira. I would recommend all of you to try and find those passages. It's actually on my website in Seminar 13. You can read all about it there, because I've brought them all. I've actually brought them all the texts in there. So for thousands of years, the great matrix of relationships, that is the web of life, was personified by the image of the Great Mother, and later by specific goddesses like Hathor in Egypt and Cybele in Anatolia. Later, the image of the goddess developed into the Holy Spirit of wisdom in the Old Testament and the Shekinah of Kabbalah, and much later into the Holy Grail of medieval legend. That's very important. The Holy Grail, if you remember, was both a vessel and a stone. Okay? In the mysterious vessel or stone that was the source of all nourishment and abundance. For years and years and years I wondered what the Holy Grail was, and it was only when I really came to understand all this that I saw, my God, it fits absolutely into this whole tradition. And of course this is what they were teaching in the 12th century, and the troubadours were taking all over Europe. So the feminine archetype has always been associated with nature and with soul, not soul in the personal sense, but soul as this great cosmic sea of being. So the alchemists kept alive this ancient cosmic concept of soul and took the image of divine wisdom, the divine wisdom within nature, as their guide. They knew her to be a living force, an active presence, pouring out the waters of love and illumination onto humanity. Alchemists who were Kabbalists knew her as the Shekinah, the bride of God, who was the divine ground of creation. She descended or emanated, as it were, from the source through all the worlds until she manifested in the world that we know and that we live in. So for many centuries in a European culture that was deeply repressive of the soul and the feminine, alchemy secretly carried the image of this disowned aspect of the divine. And perhaps this is why Marie-Louise von Franz, a very close colleague of Jung, says in her introduction to an alchemical text called the Aurora Consurgens, alchemy lays upon man the task and confers upon him the dignity of rescuing the hidden feminine aspect of God from imprisonment in matter and reuniting her with the manifest masculine deity. So can you get the idea of bringing consciousness up, as it were, from unconsciousness, bringing it up through all these phases of evolution into the time when it can become conscious within us? Have I made that really clear?
Yeah.
Good. So this is an image of Sophia, the solar Sophia, with the alchemist taking nourishment from her breasts. And in this text, the Aurora Consurgens, Sophia says to the person receiving this revelation, "Understand, ye sons of wisdom, protect me, and I will protect thee. Give me my own, that I may help you." In other words, restore me to my true position so that I can help you. So here we have an image of Sophia, or divine wisdom, personifying that subtle ground I've just tried to explain, suckling the alchemists as her sons. Now I'm just going back to this figure of Artemis of Ephesus, who was the descendant of Cybele. And if you notice, she has the black head and hands and feet, which were transmitted to the Black Virgin in Europe. She was the moon goddess, but she was much more than this in this image. She really is personifying nature. And look at how all of nature is included in this extraordinary image. I often wonder who was the artist who made it. It was copied all over the Mediterranean world. And those breasts, which are falling from her breasts, are below the lunar crescent. Somebody suggested that they were bull's balls. And I think that's just ludicrous, because it's so obvious that they are breasts. So anyway, just hold that in your mind for a minute while we move on to this one. This is 1600 years later. It is an alchemical image, and it's an image of nature presiding over the great work. But you see how a lot of what was in that earlier image is carried through into this alchemical one. And I think it's absolutely fascinating for that reason. The same lions, the same foliage. It's really lovely. And now we have this image of the alchemist following in the footsteps of nature. They said that although their work was against nature, in the sense of against all the things that hold us back from understanding anything, nature was their guide. So here we have an image of the alchemist following in nature's actual footsteps, holding as a lantern the light of the subtle world, wearing special goggles or glasses to give him insight, and holding a staff that represents the support of the teaching and the perseverance and passionate devotion to proceed step by step with the work. It's one of my favorite images. And here we have a very important image of Mercurius, the figure that they called Mercurius, in the Sea of the Soul, holding the caduceus, which was, of course, earlier held by Hermes. Now, Mercurius is one of the most enigmatic of all the alchemical images because his name describes the lumen naturae, or hidden light of the spirit that I just mentioned. And the banner over his head says Filius Noster, our son, which means that really he's another son of God that has been left in matter or is within matter that hasn't been recognized, I think. He's often shown in female as well as male form. And they called Mercurius the living gold, or the divine fire, the lumen naturae, creative spirit hidden within matter and the body and our instinctual life. However, and this is the mystery, Mercurius is the divine fire of the spirit, active within this whole life, as well as the subtle body of the soul. It's quite complicated. So he or she is the primal matter that is going to be transformed by spirit, although it's also spirit itself. He or she is the agent of transformation and is also the goal of the longed-for treasure, the philosophical gold or elixir or stone. So what it's really saying is Mercurius is everything and spirit is everything. Spirit is Mercurius. So it's a kind of algebra, as it were, of A equals B. Spirit is everything viewed at different stages of its own transformation. Stanislas Klosowski de Rola, who I think is a modern alchemist, said the alchemist possessed a knowledge of the structure of matter that far exceeded that of today's atomic physicists, which is an interesting comment. And I also wanted to bring in the thing that scientists now know, that particles are non-locally connected to each other throughout space. So what are they connected through, if not this subtle body? The alchemists call it a field. They don't know yet what it is. They know it's there, but they haven't actually penetrated into its nature, I don't think. Perhaps it's the dark matter or dark energy that they're working with. Who knows? So the origin of Mercurius goes back to Hermes, or Thoth, the guide to the underworld. Many images portray him with a caduceus and with entwined serpents. Sometimes he manifests as the dragon, sometimes the lion, the wolf, sometimes as the raven or the dove or the phoenix, depending on which stage of the process is being portrayed. So really, Mercurius personifies spirit, directing the process of its own rescue and redemption from the depths of life. All this the alchemists saw projected or saw happening in their alchemical vessel. Matter really came alive before their eyes. They saw it undergo a transformation, and they began to speak to it and to the images that it gave rise to through their imagination. The mystery drew them into it, step by step. What scientists are discovering now rests on foundations that they laid centuries ago and that have never been acknowledged, because scientists nowadays just say, oh, that's silly old rubbish. It may have been the beginning of chemistry, but it didn't really lead to anything at all. We're the ones who really understand chemistry and physics and biology and so on and so forth, which indeed they do, but there's more to be discovered.
In which of its aspects would the Mercurius be called the philosophical Mercurius?
It would be the whole process, ending up with the philosophical stone. Okay. Now here you see Mercurius in feminine form with the 4 elements around him, which are going to be related to the 4 stages of alchemy, which I'll come to this afternoon. And in a way, I think this image is fascinating because it really shows the stages of our evolution from the reptilian stage up in through the body of the mammalian phase, then the head representing the conscious mind, the neocortical mind, if you like, and the crown, the eventual awakened consciousness that we may one day move into. So there you have it in the most extraordinary composite and condensed image, really the whole work of alchemy. I think it's one of the most interesting things that can be found in alchemy. Now we have Mercurius as the green man. All over Europe in the great cathedrals, Gothic and Romanesque cathedrals, you find the image of the green man in the choir stalls, on the ceiling bosses. And all these images are the work of the master builders of the Middle Ages, many of whom were familiar with alchemy and its secrets. And all these images of the green man are proclaiming, I am the lumen naturae, the light of nature. Spirit is here and present in all of you, and all that you see and touch and hear. And the image of the green man goes back to Osiris and to Attis and Tammuz of those older Bronze Age myths, all of whom were gods of the earth's regeneration. So this image embodies spirit through the hand of the master who sculpted it. In actually making these images, this is most important. Alchemists, and all of us really who are painters or sculptors, we are embodying spirit in matter. We're doing an alchemical work. I find even in preparing this seminar, I was doing an alchemical work. And as I worked on it, I understood much more. And it's only in the work that you really understand. That's what's so fascinating. You have to do the work in order to understand. So now we come to Sol and Luna, the king and the queen. And as aspects of our own consciousness, they personify the lunar and solar ways of knowing that I've been talking about, that the alchemical work aimed to unite. As actual substances in the alchemical retort or vessel, they were the elements mercury and sulfur. Mercury, the volatile silver of mercury, and the fiery essence of sulfur. I don't know if any of you watched those programs, which were very interesting, by, I think he was a chemistry scientist called El-Khalili. Did anybody see them? Well, if you get a chance, again, do watch them, because they're absolutely fascinating. He took us through the whole process from alchemy right up to the present day of how scientists came to discover the chemistry of matter and the 92 elements which make up the great table of elements. But they're much more than this, the king and the queen, Sol and Luna. As elements of our psyche, the queen represents the instinctual matrix of the soul, the watery realm of feeling and instinct, and the king personifies the conscious mind or ego. In relation to dimensions of reality, the queen symbolizes the invisible dimension of the soul, in its wider sense, and the king, the visible manifest world. In the actual process of the work, they will undergo many transformations, but in essence they represent the two great archetypal principles, masculine and feminine aspects of spirit. So you can see that the alchemists kept the balance, kept alive the masculine and the feminine as these two essential aspects of reality. They didn't diminish one and exalt the other, they kept them balanced. At the end, in the beginning of the work, the king symbolizes the old consciousness that has to be transformed, but at the end he symbolizes the transformed consciousness that is the true gold or the stone of the philosophers. At the beginning, the queen is the materia prima, but at the end she's the prepared ground that has been tinctured with the gold of spirit. So they're not fixed in any particular state, they changed all the way through. Now here's another image of the queen on the left, the king on the right. On the left is the pelican, which is related symbolically to the queen, and on the right the phoenix, which is related to the king. And the serpent form is another form of Mercurius, who is enclosing the final red stone. And on the left is the moon, and on the right the sun. And up above is the double-headed eagle. Double-headed ego, that was an interesting slip, perhaps deliberate on the part of the unconscious, in which that can look in both directions at both worlds. Now here we have an image from a text called the Rosarium. Water and the sea have always been a symbol of the soul, and perhaps you can remember many dreams that you may have had to do with water or the sea. And remember that image of the mermaid. So in this image we see Sol and Luna immersed in the watery dimension of the soul, united in sexual union, she with a silver crown and he with a golden one. In the water with them are a submerged moon and sun. The king enters the waters of the matrix of the soul, and there he encounters a different kind of consciousness symbolized by the queen. This union, of which the alchemists recorded many phases, symbolizes the process of psychic transformation, whereby king and queen come to know each other intimately, entering into a relationship with each other. Can you imagine at this time, sexual union was never represented in any form in that culture, European culture. So this was an enormous departure and a risk to actually show such an image. So the king, the conscious mind, becomes aware of his feelings, his instincts, not as something inferior to himself as he's been taught, something that he has to dominate and subject to his will, but as something like his own mother, something that he's born out of, that he has separated from, and now needs to reunite with as his bride. So there's a whole transformation of consciousness that's going on here. And why many men are so frightened of women and of the mother is because they've emerged from the mother and they're frightened of being sucked back into that watery womb, which is very, very understandable. And to bring themselves out of that fear of the mother and into a relationship with a woman as a wife or partner is a huge transition. And it's very difficult in a culture which doesn't honor the feminine. So the queen responds and changes as the king learns how to value and relate to her, to this royal and feminine counterpart of himself. So translated into our modern understanding, I think that this union means that our logical, analytical, masculine mind, which is focused mainly through the left hemisphere today, develops a different way of perceiving reality, a more sensitive, more feminine, participatory, and empathic way of relating to life. And women also, in our present culture, need to develop this empathic way of relating to life. It's not a male thing only. So the dimension of feeling and instinct also changes as it becomes more conscious, more articulate, released from the burden of centuries of repression and negative projections. Now, I myself had a huge struggle to be able to speak in public or to speak at all. For about 30 years, I couldn't speak at all in any form in public. So, you know, this is a transformation to be allowed to use one's voice and speak and bring this wisdom up from the deep unconscious in a culture which doesn't respect it at all and which ridicules it. So this is something that all of us may find difficulty with, even with one's own family sometimes. So now we come to the image of the young king, who is here represented as the new consciousness with the old king in the background. Can you see him there in the background? He's in the waters, disappearing into the waters of the unconscious, so to speak. On the other hand, the young king has been drawn out of those waters, so the old king has been transformed in becoming this new image of the young king. And those of you who are familiar with the Grail stories will remember the story of the aged king who lies wounded in the groin, wounded in his sexuality, waiting for the Redeemer who will free the waters of the soul so that the wasteland he rules over may be restored to fertility. There you have the old myth of regeneration coming in. The text of European alchemy carried forward all the imagery of this medieval story, which is so rich in the whole thing of the transformation of the soul and the search of the knights for the Grail. Do you remember Parsifal and Galahad? And can't remember the other one beginning. No, Parsifal, Galahad. Gawain, thank you. There's a beautiful text that accompanies this picture in the Splendor Solis, which says, and this is my favorite quotation, "The king's son lies in the depths of the sea as though dead, but he lives and calls from the deep. Whosoever will free me from the waters and lead me to dry land, him will I prosper with everlasting riches. Whosoever will free me from the waters and lead me to dry land, him will I prosper with everlasting riches." That is to say, the riches that come from the illumination of the union with the divine ground. So we can identify the old king, the king who needs to die, with the deficient values and belief system that currently rule our culture, that have ruled it for nearly 4 millennia. In relation to the individual, the old king personifies a consciousness that knows nothing of its deeper ground. We can also identify the old king with an outworn image of spirit or God that needs to be relinquished in order for a new image to emerge from the depths of the soul. Now, the image of God, as I said, has been dying slowly over the last 200 years. Nietzsche commented on it when he said, "Do you not know that God is dead?" And so we've had this lessening of the numinosity of an image so that people no longer feel held by it or in wonder before it. And we have the movement to a secular culture, which was very necessary in a way in order to rediscover everything that science has connected with in focusing on matter, which had been so neglected by Christianity. It was very necessary for science to separate from religion in order that they could come to matter in a new way and hopefully begin to see it in a new light. So just as from time to time we have to buy new clothes to replace worn-out ones, so an image of spirit that has long presided over a civilization may need to be discarded in order for it to be reborn in a new form. That's the old myth of death and regeneration. So the king's son in the above text personifies the different consciousness and values generated by a deeper communion with spirit. Now, 2,000 years ago, Jesus was the young king who brought potential renewal to the culture of that time and the possibility of a transformation of our values. 500 years before him, the Buddha did the same for his culture in India. St. Francis did the same for 13th century Italy. And in my view, Jung did it for the Western civilization in our time. I think I place Jung in that sequence, as it were, of people who've been made possible a great transformation of consciousness. So in the next 2 sessions, we will look at the actual process of transformation as it's reflected in the alchemical images.
Would you also think that the young king relates back to the tradition of Horus?
Horus?
Horus.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. That's its origin in Egypt.
Yeah, that's what came to my mind, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
questions? No? Yes? Comment?
Earlier on, you referred to some of the attitudes and prejudices of that the church had set up in Western Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and how some of these sort of ideas and values are impregnated in our unconscious. For example, just take the word pagan. The word not only used to describe other religions outside Christianity, but the word pagan carries this sort of concept of something inferior and derogatory.
Mm-hmm.
Only in some of my, this is working with Roger Woolger, past lives I've had, I was mentioning or talking to about some of them to a therapist, one of your colleagues, I think, and I mentioned one I had in ancient Greece where I went to a temple that was run by priestesses, and another life in ancient Egypt where there was a high priestess which sort of manifests the divine feminine to me. Also, another one in the time of Christianity where I was a Greek Gnostic, and she immediately said, you realise they were all pagan experiences. Well, in fact, that pleased me very much, but I thought in terms of that word pagan, in lots of the Christian churches would have just referred to them as being inferior.
That's right, yes. They did, because they did receive the Christian message or revelation as something quite new, and one has to understand their point of view, I think, that there was a great deal in the old religions that was very alarming perhaps, or frightening to the kind of Christian psyche. And they gave great, because it was, as I said, I think earlier on in that picture from Vézelay, that the Christian thing was placed within, very much within the context of the future soul of man, not only the present life, whereas the pagan religions were more grounded in this life, so to speak. They weren't focused on the afterlife nearly so much, where the emphasis of Christianity was on the afterlife and on the resurrection of the body after death. So I think that was where the kind of division came. And also they looked upon, they couldn't bear anything to do with the goddess. So anything which resembled the worship of the goddess, whether it was Ishtar, the great whore of Babylon or whatever, or even whether it was Roman or the Greek goddesses, they did look down on as being definitely a phase that was outgrown and that we had to move forward into this new phase. So certainly paganism was repressed and vilified. But one can understand that point of view, I think, to keep the balance also. One mustn't put too much of a derogatory view on Christianity when you saw what they were trying to do. So I think, Michael, you want to, can we have the stick go back?
Slightly concerned about the attitude towards Christianity, because I think we have to be quite clear that the early Christian texts, of which there were a great variety, say the 2nd century AD, there was very firm traditions of the goddess within them. In
the Gnostic text.
In the Gnostic, or the so-called Gnostic.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why that disappeared was really for reasons of power and politics. And
Okay,
I think that gentleman talking about the attitude towards pagans, I think we can see that in terms of reasons of power and politics as well.
Yes.
So I do think that we need to draw this distinction.
Yeah. I agree with you there. I can't carry everything in my head, so I'm glad you've brought it up. But there was a terrible repression, definitely, of the Gnostic sects and of this feminine tradition and different kind of much more inward-looking tradition. And it was mainly brought about by two emperors, Constantine and Theodosius, in the 4th century. And that led to the repression of the Gnostic sects and the really outlawing of anything to do with paganism. Paganism became a heresy then, didn't it, Michael?
I mean, the last Egyptian temple wasn't really closed down until the early 6th century.
In Justinian's time.
It was Philae.
Yeah.
So the strength of that cult was so strong that no one dared to try and close it down.
No, it was Justinian who closed down the Platonic Academy and the pagan cults, if I remember correctly, and that was the 6th century. So that was the end, as it were, of paganism. And then it had to go really underground and surfaced up again in the Grail legends, I think, in the Middle Ages, which also had the appreciation of woman coming up against the whole tradition of the church, which was that woman was almost a demonic being, really. Anyway, I think I've talked enough, and I think we must break for lunch.